Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Melbourne Knowledge Week. I'm Michelle Fitzgerald. I look after Smart City Office and Digital here at the City of Melbourne. On behalf of Councillor Watts, Councillor Oak, and all of my colleagues who are here today for Melbourne Knowledge Week, we very much welcome you. We have a day today of exciting talks, workshops and demonstrations, all focused on Melbourne Innovation Districts. I'm just going to say MID from now on. It's just too many syllables and I haven't had enough coffees. We are actually located today here in City North, which is the first of the Melbourne Innovation Districts, or MIDs, that we are launching together in partnership with University of Melbourne and RMIT. So I'd like to introduce Councillor Watts, who will formally welcome us here today, and I'll then pass on to our keynote speakers. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the City of Melbourne, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to Melbourne Knowledge Week 2019. The City of Melbourne respectfully acknowledges the traditional owners of the land for the Waiwurrung, the Wurundjeri, the Boonwurrung, Tarongarong, Djadjawurrung groups that form the Kulin Nation. Melbourne's always been an important meeting place for events of social, educational, sporting and cultural significance. I expect one could imagine that this was, in fact, an MID way back then. We're proud to say that Melbourne continues to be such a place. I'd acknowledge, if I may, Cathy Oak, my colleague on council, today's speakers and panellists, and of course the very important sponsors of Knowledge Week, including the University of Melbourne, the RACV, Arrivo, OR Media, Accenture and LCI Melbourne. And of course the Melbourne Innovation District partners. Welcome to everybody. Now, trusted partnerships and industry precincts have helped shape various aspects of Melbourne for many, many years. And I would argue this preparedness in Melbourne to collaborate is a defining characteristic and has been underpinning Melbourne's prosperity for a very long time. And with the ascendancy of the knowledge sector in our economy, partnerships and collaborations are central to improving our capacity to attract talent and investment to Melbourne. Now, today's event on MIDs presents an opportunity to investigate, and I would say interrogate, a new form of collaboration, one with geographic, intellectual and contractual elements, that being the very stimulating concept of the MID. Let me put it to you that an MID, for me anyway, is almost to be considered a strategy pursued by whomever, which taps into and builds upon economic, geography and pre-existing strengths. This strategy, as I see it, is what is the basis of the MID in our City of Melbourne. Now, acknowledging the strengths, questions arise in relation to the knowledge sector. How do we maximise Melbourne's strengths in urban design, clean tech, smart cities technology, life sciences and other fields of expertise? How do we successfully capture our pre-existing strengths to better accommodate the extraordinary growth in our city and at the same time prepare for growth in the future? How do we build on that which is already there more successfully? My assumption is that many of you here are already deeply immersed in the thinking and planning behind the Melbourne Innovation District in particular. But for those who are less familiar, perhaps a brief snapshot of Melbourne's Innovation District would be useful. But first, let's remember, shall we, that all innovation districts are unique constructions emerging from a particular set of circumstances, a particular time and a particular place. The Melbourne Innovation District was launched in 2017, and it's an interesting one because it's actually a formal partnership between the City of Melbourne, local government, and two major universities. In part, it's a recognition of the extraordinary potential within a relatively small geographic area to the city's inner north, coupled with an extraordinary number of knowledge sector organisations located there. Clearly, this precinct was ripe for productive partnerships. Two leading universities, globally recognised medical and research institutions, teaching hospitals, biomedical centre, museums, libraries, etc., and not forgetting 200,000 students and up to 60,000 international ones at that, all located kind of here. Melbourne's academic and research talent pool is very deep and is located right here, much of it, not all of it. Collectively, this mix is potent, attractive to talent, attractive to tech companies and startups in increasing numbers. Outside the institutional accelerating programs, independent co-working spaces are proliferating in Melbourne. People want to be here, people want to take part. There is a buzz around Melbourne. Now, all of this intellectual energy and entrepreneurial clout in such close proximity forms the very bedrock of MID. A very limited geographic area which incorporates in which there are also corporates which can be readily connected with the academic, with government, with the community in new and dynamic ways. So high quality public realm conducive to these connections, these collaborations is important. All of this activity amid high quality, purposely designed public realm will increase the likelihood that a fertile climate for collaboration and serendipitous connections will flourish. And that's the idea of it. Now, Melbourne, as you know, is a renowned livable city and an accessible city, I would argue, characterised by compact mixed-use neighbourhoods, well-connected public transport, cycling, walking routes, access to knowledge sector employment, to universities, ample recreation facilities and green public spaces. We are pretty good on a global ranking for livable cities and intelligent cities. Now, add to this lovely, I would say, fortunate mix, add a diverse population, comparative political harmony, not so much quite now, but cultural riches and a benign climate. Now, all of these attributes are generally present in all renowned innovation districts elsewhere in the world. Melbourne ticks many boxes in relation to innovation districts. So ask yourself, what can the formal partnership between a local government and the universities bring to an MID? Our contribution focuses upon 5 contributory elements: urban realm, institutional design, enterprise activation, social innovation, and deep technology. And today's event presents, I think, a terrific opportunity to explore these elements in more detail. It seems very fitting to me that this opportunity to delve into such a fascinating future-focused concept manifested in the Melbourne Innovation District be presented as part of Knowledge Week. And as Chair of Knowledge City, I'm very proud that the City of Melbourne is in the vanguard of Innovation District creation in Australia. A reminder that, if I may, that our theme for Knowledge Week this year is What If? And I hope that you will apply it as you listen to information about our district. Share your thoughts at the end of it with anyone who'll listen, including me, about the what-ifs. Please enjoy the day, and I sincerely thank you for taking part. This is an exciting concept, and we're 1 year into a 3-year arrangement, and we really are very keen to hear your informed responses to what we are trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watts. I'd now like to ask Professor Lars Koenen and Dr. Julie Miao to join me up here on the stage and to get settled whilst I introduce you. So Professor Lars Koenen, hello Lars, is the inaugural City of Melbourne Chair of Resilient Cities at the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. In partnership with the Resilient Melbourne office, Lars seeks to strengthen Melbourne's role as a leader in knowledge-based urban resilience and leverage opportunities for collaborative research between universities and cities. Prior to coming to Melbourne, Lars was Professor in Innovation Studies at Lund University, Sweden, and well known internationally for his work on regional and urban innovation, and more recently for his pioneering research on the geography of environmental innovation and sustainability transitions. Lars is currently working on action research that analyses the implementation of the Resilient Melbourne strategy and on the development of a smart specialisation strategy to grow regional resilience in Gippsland. Following Lars will be Dr. Julie Miao. Julie is a senior lecturer in property and economic development in the University of Melbourne and an honorary fellow in Shanghai Jiao Tong University and Hong Kong University. And Julie tells me she's been in Melbourne for a few months now. She enjoys the weather. Julie's research covers the economics, planning and the built environment of the knowledge economy, knowledge workers, housing market dynamics and affordability, as well as innovative, informal and entrepreneurial urbanism. She's conducted impactful research on different types of development zones in innovation districts in China, Singapore, Japan and Africa, as well as creative clusters in the UK, Spain and Finland, which places her ideally at the junctions between the East and West and between the developing and developed economies. After publishing her edited book on Technopoles of the World Revisited, Julie is now working on the interactions between buzz and the built environment in innovation districts. Together, Julie and Lars will be talking to us this morning about the public purpose of innovation districts. MID is part of a global wave of urban best practice to demonstrate leadership in the knowledge economy. And we're very well positioned here in Melbourne, as Councillor Watts explained to us, to foster and grow thriving innovation districts, given our presence of world-class universities, a dynamic and highly educated startup scene, and our reputation and livability. But how can we make the most of our innovation districts? We'll have the opportunity for questions at the end, and now please join me in welcoming Professor Lars Koenen. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Councillor Watts, for the introductions for today. So yes, let's indeed try and interrogate the public purpose of innovation districts. Let's see if the slides could come up. That question is partly also triggered by recent sort of news coming out of various parts of the world where big cities are trying to foster innovation districts or set up smart city laboratories. For example, the waterfront development in Toronto, led by Sideway Walks, a sister company to Google, which is very much also fashioned around the idea of urban redevelopment, growing an innovation precinct, but which is increasingly meeting also resistance from the publics who feel that they're not being listened to, that sort of a privatization is sort of taking too big a role in innovation districts. So what Julie and I really would like to sort of have a conversation around today is, what's really the public purpose of innovation districts, and how could we increase that? So, as Michelle already said, I'm an economic geographer. I'm interested in the geography of innovation, where innovation happens and why there. And that's sort of, we've been facing a bit of an uphill battle there, because in an era of globalization, there's been a lot of discourse that sort of preaches that geography doesn't matter anymore, there's a death of distance, but still, innovation does not happen anywhere. Even though the internet has made information and knowledge far more available across the world, there are still centripetal forces at play when it comes to innovation. Already in the 1920s, the economist Alfred Marshall pointed out that there are agglomeration economies when it comes to the development of new products, processes, new technologies. And as a result, innovation is unevenly distributed across space. And this has profound implications in terms of prosperity and well-being. This is a map from basically my previous job in Lund, where I showed to my students how sort of the competitiveness of regions is distributed across Europe, as well as the innovation performance of regions in Europe. And on the left you see a map around competitiveness, on the right it's around innovation. And first of all, what you see is that innovation seems to be a very strong predictor of which regions are competitive, but also that it has a very distinct geography. Classically, Southern Europe is lagging behind in terms of competitiveness and innovation. The same goes for Eastern Europe. And also within countries, you see marked differences. And particularly see that the capital regions often stand out as being the more innovative and the more competitive regions. Similarly, if you would look at the top 10 list of most innovative regions in Europe, you'd find a lot of the capital regions. London, Stockholm, Hoofdstaden, that stands for Copenhagen, Ile-de-France, that's Paris. So classically, capital cities are more innovative and are sort of the innovation motors of a country. So the innovation districts, in a sense, demonstrate a greater self-awareness of cities about their importance and their significance as drivers of innovation and prosperity in the knowledge economy. But first of all, let's ask, what is a knowledge economy? For some, it equals high-tech sectors and their increased significance in the economy. For example, IT, life science, other science-based industries. But for others, including myself, it refers actually more to the increased importance of knowledge and learning across all sectors in the economy, not just the high-tech sectors, but also low-tech sectors, traditional service sectors are all being affected by an increased reliance on knowledge as a determinant of economic success and economic performance. So, how do we define innovation districts? We have to go to the Brookings Institute, the main intellectual advocate of innovation districts, who would define it as place-based urban development strategies that aim to replicate the success of spontaneous innovation districts such as Silicon Valley. They are geographic areas where leading-edge anchor institutions and companies cluster and connect with startups, business incubators, and accelerators. And SGS Economics and Planning recently wrote a report and outlined 5 sort of critical components of an innovation district. It has to have critical mass in terms of innovation assets and resources. It has to have a distinctiveness, a uniqueness, and that kind of gives it competitive advantage. There has to be a good quality of place for the residents and the workers and companies in the innovation district. There needs to be diversity and inclusion, sort of diversity to foster the creativity that is needed in an innovation district. And finally, there needs to be a culture of collaboration in place. As Councillor Watts already outlined, Melbourne and the Melbourne Innovation District is very well positioned to have thriving innovation districts. We have a lot of well-known, globally leading universities in the city, and notably here in Melbourne North. And we also see that the Innovation District is really trying to leverage some of the world-class knowledge, for example, around medicine and life science, and probably the Parkville Medical Precinct is one of the most successful life science clusters in the world, even though it's maybe not acknowledged for that. Quality of place is a bit of a no-brainer, of course, with Melbourne being one of the most livable cities in the world. Melbourne is also a truly multicultural city, so in terms of diversity and inclusion, we're probably also doing very well. The thing that might cause some worry and concern is around culture of collaboration. We know at the national level that Australia is performing very poorly when it comes to collaboration across sectors, when it comes to innovation. For example, collaboration between universities and industry is rock bottom in OECD rankings for Australia. I have my doubts that that would also apply for Melbourne. On the other hand, we don't really know. We don't have the metrics, and I'll come back to that in a bit, to say something at a more granular level about these sort of innovation characteristics in Australia. But let's also perhaps have a look back at Silicon Valley, which is, after all, sort of the real source of inspiration for innovation districts. What is currently happening in the Valley? It seems to be facing some problems, as increasingly companies are actually leaving Silicon Valley. And The Economist had an article last year around Silicon Valley having peaked. And a lot has to do with the sheer expense of being in the Valley. Some studies found that young startups pay at least 4 times as much for being located in Silicon Valley as they would do in other still highly profiled innovation districts or precincts in American cities. And this makes it very difficult for young startups to be in Silicon Valley, especially with really sort of new emerging technologies. They might even have sort of more tighter budgets to take into account. And that hasn't really touched upon issues like also increased congestion, increased homelessness, and rising inequality in Silicon Valley. And again, that is something that for many economists is not a great surprise. It points to the sort of negative externalities around agglomerations. High land rents, increasing amounts of congestion, increasing amounts of pollution. And I think that does sort of raise a couple of important questions also for the MID and for Melbourne, because we also have issues with housing affordability and soaring house prices in Melbourne. And we do have some significant problems with traffic and congestion in Melbourne. So there's maybe some lessons to be learned here from what has happened or what is happening with Silicon Valley with regard to how we could preempt those issues here in Melbourne and not fall into the same trap. However, what I would like to really sort of point out is a perhaps even more disturbing externality that's at play, and that's around territorial inequality. And this points to the work of a colleague at London School of Economics, Andres Rodriguez-Pose, who also sort of makes a connection between the economic strength, importance, and growth that is happening in the capital cities, and notably fueled by innovation districts and precincts such as this. And at the same time, the flip side of the coin, long periods of low or negative growth in rural and regional areas, and areas that are facing industrial and agricultural decline, and where there's a real brain drain happening from these areas into the cities, into the Melbournes and the Sydneys of this world, and into the innovation districts. And that is leaving these places with very little hope for the future, and which is causing what he's called a geography of discontent. And he's been looking at the picture, the maps of voting behavior recently. For example, around Brexit, around the election of Trump. And what he points at is that we see that the economically boosting, the innovative parts of a country typically vote for the progressive parties, but it's the regions that are lagging behind that are increasingly voting for populism, for Brexit, for Trump. And there might be even sort of an analogy made here between the recent election results here in Australia and Queensland maybe not seeing the opportunities, or regional Queensland not seeing the opportunities of a low-carbon economy, and rather sort of sticking to their traditional strength in mining. But what the point is here really is that these votes for populism are actually creating some real problems also for the successful parts of the country. For example, London is obviously not very keen on a Brexit, but is faced now with this revenge of the places that don't matter through the Brexit vote, and is facing a real backlash here. So I think there's some lessons here or some warnings around what's the public purpose of innovation districts and of concentrating innovation, prosperity, and economic growth in the major cities, in the capital areas. So we may need to have a bit more of a balanced approach to innovation districts. And in part, I think the MID is demonstrating leadership in that respect. So one of the aspects I would like to raise some attention for is this is not just about increasing the rate of innovation through innovation districts. It's not just about sort of capitalizing on the knowledge assets of universities, of young startups, and so on and so on. It is also really about the content and the quality of innovation. So the MID has a wonderful opportunity here to trial and develop innovations that really speak to some of the problems that Melbourne is going to face in the future, around, for example, congestion, around climate change, around housing affordability. And again, we see that this is a wider trend happening, especially in Europe, where currently a lot of the innovation policy is directly addressing so-called societal missions. And this is some of the work that Mariana Mazzucato, who visited Melbourne last year, has been very influential in. So her point is, we really need to have a discussion not just about the rates of growth, but really also about the directions of growth. And really make sure that we create inclusive growth trajectories, green growth trajectories, and equally, we really need to think about green innovation, inclusive innovation, etc. So that makes probably the case for policy matters even stronger. I mean, already there's a market failure around innovation. Pure markets do not incentivize innovation. The risks and uncertainties are too high, with failure rates of approximately 90%. And that's why innovation generally requires both venture capital, stable public investments, and research and development. And in a lot of countries, notably in the European Union, this has led to quite sophisticated policy mixes and policy portfolios, sort of trying to stimulate innovation from various angles and perspectives. However, again, if you would look at OECD studies, Australia is typically sort of regarded as somewhat of a laggard when it comes to innovation policy. Partly that has to do with the fact that the main innovation instrument that's being used in this country is R&D rebates for individual companies. And that doesn't acknowledge that innovation often is sort of it draws on collaboration, draws on relationships between companies or between companies and universities and research institutes. And this is something that is not being incentivized by the current dominant innovation policy instrument in Australia. Neither is there a whole-of-government approach to innovation in this country, where often local, state, and federal governments tend to move in different directions when it comes to innovation and research policy. And finally, we could say that at the national level, Australia lacks clearly defined goals, problems, and targets when it comes to innovation policy, and is often criticized in international benchmarks for being too generic. So here again, there's a wonderful opportunity with the innovation districts to really have a bespoke approach to innovation and innovation policy. And as Councillor Watts already outlined, it's really acknowledging the strengths and also the weaknesses that a district and that a city has, and to really curate and develop policy that speaks to the unique sort of place-based characteristics of an innovation ecosystem. So that's what I think is really the strength of the whole innovation district approach, that it really speaks to the place-based nature of innovation. And that really begs the question also to think about what is particular about innovation in Melbourne. I already mentioned the Parkville Medical Precinct. I think really it's probably one of the most well-hidden life science clusters in the world. And also, I mean, acknowledging the sort of the academic strengths of the University of Melbourne and RMIT, but at the same time perhaps trying to develop policies, programs that would stimulate these organizations to better engage with their surrounding societies and be less of an ivory tower. But finally, what I would really like to emphasize here is that we probably need to step up our game when it comes to having an evidence-based policy and to have more accurate and granular data and metrics around innovation. We don't know in Australia whether our cities and precincts, how they are performing in terms of innovation. My guess is that they are not following sort of the national trends, but this is only a guess. And we really need more reliable and sophisticated data on innovation in this country. And there is a lot of good examples from overseas. The Community Innovation Survey has been used now for over 10 years in the European Union to do very sort of direct measurements of how companies innovate, with whom they collaborate, what their barriers are. And this data is really used to then actually inform policy making at local, regional, and national levels. And I think that is really a way to go also for Australia, and also to see whether the MID partnership is a successful one. If we don't measure innovation in the Innovation District, it'll be hard to say whether it's a success or not. All right, that's it for me. Apologies for being a bit slow. I unfortunately got caught by a flu or a bug of sorts. So I probably won't be staying around for too long today, which is really unfortunate. I was really looking forward to the Knowledge Week. I'll now leave the floor to Julie, who will have some really interesting examples of innovation districts from across the world. Thank you very much.
Okay, maybe first I can say thank you very much. It's really honor. I'm really honored to be here, to be part of the conversation around Melbourne Innovation District and Australia's innovation system in a wider perspective. So I have really a lot to share today based on my past experience. But today, what I really want to do is to, elaborate on what my colleague Lars just mentioned about early on. There are 3 points that to me are very important. First is to emphasize a place-based nature around about innovation and place-based development policy. And also I want to raise a challenge because a lack of reliable and sophisticated data both calls for a collective action in terms of developing innovation district and make it work. Because of time constraint, I think today I will focus on the first point, on a place-based nature of innovation and innovation district. And then I welcome questions and discussions around across the presentation today. So I think I will move around. I really not comfortable stay here. So for me, one purpose of investing on innovation districts is really to leverage a wider range of investment from both the public and the private investment, as well as to raise social and economic benefit. Because most of this investment will be deeply embedded in their local context, so that leads me to expecting we will see a diverse range of objectives as well as detailed approach in order to achieve objective of innovation district. So based on my experience, I could at least distill 3 potential models to develop innovation district here. So they are regeneration-led, model, a new sector-led model, and property-led model. So in what follows, I will use some examples to illustrate what do I mean by the different potential models and their pros and cons. So first is regeneration-led development. When we think about regeneration-led development of innovation district, I think the typical case come to our mind is Barcelona 22 Act. But today, I want to introduce a slightly less known but equally interesting example from Finland. It's called Kalastama Smart City District. To begin with, I think both the policymaker and the citizens in Helsinki, they are very suspicious and they even criticize the whole smart city idea, even based on my interview with the deputy mayor of Helsinki. So instead, they came up with a more down-to-earth objective for Helsinki's smart city initiative. That is, they want to build the most functional city in the world. For them, I think that's much more understandable to Finns. And with this initiative, Kalastama, the objective is to create 1 more hour per day by introducing innovative public services. So let's look at the location of Kalastama. It's somewhere here, towards the northeast edge of the established city of Helsinki. It covers a total area of 177 hectares and supposed to provide around 18,000 residents and creating 8,000 jobs. So it's on a much smaller scale compared to Melbourne Innovation District. But when I look at this example, I think it offers a very good, maybe reference point towards our regeneration of Victoria Market Precinct, for example. So that's why I bring it to our attention today. So there is a subway station passing through Kalastama, so linking to the city center within about 30, 40 minutes. But about 10 years ago, hardly anyone stopped by at this subway station. Why? Because 10 years ago, the landscape in Kalastama is mainly made up with wasteland and grimy office blocks, as you can still see it here. The only public infrastructure then and now is this public-owned power station. That's a picture of Kalastama. So the idea of turning Kalastama into an innovative smart city district came around 2009, 2010. So the city really opened up the debate to the citizens. They invite suggestions from public sector, from residents, to suggesting what project you want to see, you want us to build in this district. So among these projects adopted, we have a floating smart apartment here, for example, and a shared electronic vehicle testing point here. Also this future school, so I visited this future school. It has no office, no traditional teaching room, no classroom. So kids are free to run around, try different, it's quite like the setting today, actually. And also this co-created senior house. So this place is really residents came together, designed the whole building and the public space together. Another interesting project I was drawn attention to is this, vacuum waste collection system. So in this waste collection point, so the waste will be transported to some kind of central waste management facilities under underground through the pipeline. What struck me here is actually not this physical waste collecting point per se, but the pipeline underneath. I was told the story that this pipeline was actually built around 60 or 70 years ago because the city at that time was thinking of providing central heating and cooling system throughout the city. So by having flexibility into their mind, so these pipelines were actually kept in use so the city can continuously adding new layers of ICT facility, and now this waste collection facility through the same pipeline without digging new holes on the ground. So for me, that's smart. That's really forward looking for the public sector. So I think that's what interests me as smart. It's a great example here. Another interesting project used by the city is called agile piloting. So the idea is really to provide a platform for small media companies and anyone who providing kind of public, online public services to try their prototype in real situation with real users. The city itself offers small amount of seed funding, 1,000 to 8,000 euros. That's tiny. But the benefits they offered to any project participate here are twofold to me. First is that they can try their idea for free in class comma, totally no cost, anything. They welcome any idea to try it out. Second is the credibility that the city offers to the small media enterprise. The city kind of gives these companies a certification saying, now you pass this pilot stage, you can promote your product internationally, holding the certification the city giving to you. So for me, by having this kind of certification system, the company benefits by able to selling their product. The city also benefits by building their reputation, be a world-leading smart city. You tried your product here, you can try it everywhere. So that's, for me, again, very smart strategy used by the city to encourage entrepreneurship, but also to build its own reputation globally. So I think that's quite good practice. Then move on to a new sector-led innovation district development model. Here, as we all know, there is a tendency for new sectors to seeking for greenfield development, both because of the push factor. My background is property, so as we all know, the land price in established city centers tend to be much higher and affordable for smaller startup companies, but also because these pull factors, especially for creative, innovative companies, they are attracted by some kind of suburb, campus, and garden-style atmosphere. So that is why a lot of these new sector-led development tend to be slightly outside the established city center. Here, the typical case came to our mind is Silicon Valley. My colleague Lars mentioned about it before. But here, I want to draw your attention to a less known but emerging initiative in China called feature towns. As the name can already tell you, to be quantified as a feature town, that area, that district has to specialize in a particular industry sector. So in my mind, this feature town is kind of Chinese version of the European smart specialization strategy. A lot of feature towns choose to focusing on ICT sector or internet-based platform development, as my example, Dreamtown, will demonstrate later. What different feature towns from, say, industrial parks, science parks, is that the emphasis on life-work balance and the small town feeling, really green and relaxing. You can live and work and basically fulfill your life here. So the idea of feature town was first initiated by Hangzhou City in Zhejiang province. What interesting me is, if you look at this picture, actually these dream towns, they play within a much more strategic picture of the city. So they are the anchor point of the future city corridor for the whole city, as you can see in this map. So the company Alibaba, maybe some of you have already know, played a very crucial role in leading the development of this future city corridor. So it has this cloud computing factory here, and also around Dreamtown in the middle part of this corridor. Then towards the east end of this corridor, we have Zhejiang University campus, new campus, which is easily the top 5 Chinese universities. So it has these 2 anchor institutions supporting the development of this whole corridor. Let's zoom in on Dreamtown. That's my case study here. So we have the city center here. So Dreamtown only covers about 3 kilometers. Again, very small. But if you look at the whole strategic plan of Dreamtown, it is actually within a bigger initiative, again, a bigger initiative of Technology City. So although in Dreamtown itself, it's mainly focusing on offering office space and incubating space, but for employees working there, they can actually access a whole range of public services. For example, you have, this is Central Park and Central CBD area. This is RD Park, Research Development Park. University is here, and public service areas here, and you have Dreamtown centrally located within, surrounding this by this urban infrastructure. So what's the performance of Dreamtown by now? Within 2 years, it has already supported over 900 startup companies and attracted nearly 9,000 jobs. Many of them are new graduate students just from Hangzhou University or local universities. So to me, I think Dreamtown offers a very interesting reference point to Melbourne Connect, perhaps. But the idea is any individual office block cannot be built on its own, on isolation. You have to surround it. You have to providing all the urban facilities and functions surrounding this single building. So it's an ecosystem. You are building an ecosystem instead of single office block, for example. So that's the lesson I draw from Dreamtown. Quickly move on. My last example here is property-led development. To many, in many academics' mind, when we think about property-led development, we immediately think about, oh, that's just window dressing or beautifying project. Nothing new or no added value will be brought in. But actually, in my mind, I think for this model itself, we have nothing to blame. The main thing is it does require a more coordinated approach in order to make a property-led development really work. So here my example is this Baltic Triangle Creative Cluster in Liverpool. This is a picture I took October last year. So even though it has been building reputation as a creative cluster in Liverpool, you you could still see, I think over half of the building is still left not vacant, left in vacant. So it's really an innovation district on the emerging. So that's why I brought this case into the discussion today. The location itself is actually very strategic. If you have been to Liverpool before, so you have the Lim Street station here, Central Station here, so all within walking distance to Baltic Triangle. Also, Liverpool 1, that's a picture here, is a new developed commercial center, supposed to be the biggest in England. Maybe it will very soon be overtaken by another development as the biggest one. So Liverpool 1 links up to this old commercial district here. Also, it has a very successfully regenerated pier head here. So a lot of these historical buildings dated back to Victoria era has been repurposed, so become very popular, like almost like central CBD office area now. And also this Albert Dock area, again, used to be a port area left vacant, but now it has attracted the most luxury residential development and hotel development in this area. So surrounding Baltic Triangle, you can actually see a lot of strategic development happening. So what's going on in Baltic? As you can see from the picture I showed you at the beginning, as well as the background of this news article, still most of the buildings there are in a derelict situation, simply because the city council does not have the necessary resources to initiate the regeneration process. So what happened there then? What I find interesting is this company. So this is Mark, that's a manager of a company called Baltic Creative Community Interest Company. I interviewed this guy, very energetic. So this company started as a not-for-profit organization. It started by getting some funding from the European Union, and they bought this shared building, refurbished it, subdivided, and rented out to 10 digital companies. Very soon, based on the success of their business model, the company turned into a property developer and manager. So it positioned itself as a place shaper of Baltic Triangle. So by the time I visited Baltic, the company has successfully acquired another 3 buildings in a similar situation, very cheap. And they cheaply furbish it and providing affordable rent to creative and the digital sectors. What's also interesting me is that together with other local business, the Baltic Creative Community Interest Company actually trying to shape the whole image of Baltic Triangle. This area used to have a neighborhood plan issued by the city council, but this plan was criticized by the local businessmen for being too abstract to be excited about, and too restrict to attract investment. So instead, they came up with their own local plan for Baltic Triangle, and they have been proactively marketing the image around their own networks through, like, We Make Place, a lot of this social media, and their own platform. A latest addition to the regeneration of Baltic Triangle is this Chin's Brewery. Very similar to, it draws my kind of similarity to the meat market, actually. It's a big, like, used to be a brewery building, and they turned it into like food market, and also a lot of interesting pubs. So it's not like exhibition, anything normal citizen cannot afford. So so they make it like basically become a daily destination for the residents in Liverpool and nearby. Also, at the back of this building, there is a very cheap place for makers market. So anyone you are selling second-hand food, second-hand clothes, and handmade stuff, you can actually rent a tiny tent and sell your products. I waited there, it's like the setting, the physical setting is nothing to be like exciting about, but it's mainly, you see people are really appreciate there is a place for them to sell their products. So that's interesting me. And now it has become maybe one of the coolest places to go to in Liverpool. So I think this is basically the examples I want to share. A bit scattered around, but the question I want to pose now is what exactly is Melbourne Innovation District want to take? What development approach our Innovation District want to take? Is it a combination of the three, perhaps? Or are we going to generating an alternative to these more established models? I think that's an important question to reflecting upon, because that will decide what objective we want to achieve as a stakeholder of Melbourne Innovation District. And having a clear objective will then decide what exactly are the indicators we want to collect and where and what are the data we want to use to measure our progress. The last thing I want to say is the relationship between different holders. So among the three examples, you can see Finland is pretty much public-private partnership, citizens engaged. China, top-down initiative, whereas Liverpool, you have grassroots, bottom-up initiative. So that poses a question, how do we manage collective actions in achieving our objective in Innovation District? So I think I will stop here and we welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie and Lars. So much insight, and those examples from around the world are so pertinent for Melbourne and really, really interesting. We are really pressed for time, and I'm going to pass straight to our very active audience here for questions. I do recognise quite a few faces from government and from our innovation partners, amongst others. Do we have any questions for Julie and Lars? Yes. A microphone's coming your way.
Thanks, guys. Thanks a lot. I've been working for the last 10 years for a very large Swedish company. Actually, it was part of the design of Stockholm Royal Seaport and a few projects in China, etc. And one of the interesting things we see when we compare success stories in Europe and in China compared to Australia, or the failure in Australia compared to successes there, is that they've overcome issues that we haven't on regulatory policy, basically interpretation of democracy, where in Europe they've got something called the European Union and European mandates that impose rules on you that you have to, for example, the company I worked for, Ericsson, had a mandate to recycle every product that they make, to take it back. We don't have that. And conversely, in China, there isn't a need for a voter popularity of a project. National benefit counts, and then something goes ahead. And here in Australia, I worked in energy policy for the last 10 years in Australia. Here in Australia, we've got policy that totally contradicts any business case by any sector, the energy, the industrial, for the simple reason that it's democratically popular, that it brings voters. And my question is, how do we, and again, I might be sounding a little bit cynical in saying that what you guys talked about, while it's brilliant and clever and good, is not relevant to Australia because we haven't solved that basic problem. So having been in Australia long enough, I'm asking you, what do you think, how can we I mean, you might not agree with the obstacle that I described, but if you do, how do we overcome it?
Lars.
Populism versus
away.
evidence-based benefit.
Right. Yeah, that's a big question, of course, but a very interesting one. And you know, I moved from Sweden 2.5 years ago to Australia, so it's a question that's on my mind a lot as well. And I share your view that the relationship between the public sector and the private sector is fundamentally different in Europe compared to Australia. But I think there's at the same time, you know, we don't want to stereotype Australia too much either, because there are important place-based differences. So while maybe you know, the way you describe the situation applies very much at the national level, I think there are other governance models at play and on other scales. And I think, you know, for example, local governments in Australia have a fundamentally different relationship to their citizens, to the private sector, to business, a much more associative model, I would say, than what you'd find at the federal level, which is much more laissez-faire and arm's length. So I think an innovation district is a wonderful experiment to indeed trial other governance models and other relationships, modes of interacting between sectors. But then the crucial thing is that those local experiments are visible, and that also other parts of government would be able to learn from them. And again, that is something that is very much institutionalized in Europe through the EU, where regions and cities are seen as experiments for other layers of government, for policy innovation. And I think there is a challenge in Australia that we don't have a joined-up government, and there's a lot of learnings that might go missing between local, state, and federal government. But if that could be done better, I think there's a lot that could be learned, for example, from, you know, the way that local governments are operating, which are far more similar, perhaps, to the way that that's happening in the EU or in China.
Actually, it's hard for me to commenting. I only been in Australia for 9 months so far. And also, I think it's quite difficult to generalize, say, lessons from Europe, UK, China to Australia, indeed. With the Chinese, maybe I can say a bit more about the Chinese model, the democracy stuff. Although a lot of policy making in China hasn't gone through public debate, but you do have a severe local government competition. So a lot of these policy models, this investment actually fail. So they will be replaced by a new idea, new project. So it's always actually one initiative die, the other emerging. Even with feature towns, actually feature town was heavily promoted by Zhejiang province to central government among its competitors of, say, the model promoted by Shanghai, by Beijing, and by Guangzhou. But this model actually win and get the attention from the central government. But how long it will last, I mean, it's an open question. Whether this model will survive the market test is a question. Then with Australia, I think my reading of the innovation policy in general is, I think there is a lack of a clear objective, what the government want to achieve with supporting knowledge economy, supporting innovation system. And also, there is a lack of consistency in your policy as well. I think that's, to me, a key challenge, and maybe some lesson we can learn from other countries. Thank you.
We have time for one final question before we move on to our next panel. Yes.
Cheers. Hello. Vanessa Campbell from Melbourne Connect. Thank you very much for both of your presentations. I'm interested in the thematic focus of an innovation district and how wide or narrow you think that needs to be for success, and particularly in your case, Julie, how a thematic focus might influence the choice of development model for an innovation precinct. How narrow or wide can a thematic focus be in those different development models that you introduced us to? Thank you.
I think a wider model, wider objective might be better than just narrowly focusing on, especially with Melbourne Connect. I think the whole idea is actually to encourage entrepreneurship, offering incubating services to emerging companies. That's my reading of Melbourne Connect, the objective. So it's quite hard to tell what are the future industries, who will be the next winner or loser. So by offering this test bed for small companies or even graduates, I think we are actually giving us flexibility to maybe fit for the change of the future of the technology. That's my kind of immediate reaction to your question.
It's also how you would define thematic, because I think here in Melbourne, when you look at it from a supply side, we've got two very comprehensive, broad universities who have a wide sort of supply of different kinds of knowledge and expertise available. So it would be rather silly to then sort of just focus on one particular sector. And we also see that in the MID there are sort of, you know, different sort of sectoral sort of foci. I think it's more interesting to then also have a discussion around the thematic sort of focus on the sort of demand side of innovation. And that was my point about being perhaps a bit more mission-oriented, to sort of focus on a set of pressing societal problems which really require attention now to make Melbourne sustainable and livable in the future. And I think there would be a lot of opportunity for innovation in bringing all of the broad sets of knowledge that we have at RMIT, the University of Melbourne, and in the business sector, and to bring that together to address those problems, both from sort of, you know, from different sort of engineering and technical perspectives, as well as different sort of HUS perspectives, because, you know, things like, you know, the impact of climate change on Melbourne require sort of attention from a whole range of disciplines, and a lot of innovation will happen at the intersections where these disciplines actually start to get in a conversation with each other. So I think that, you know, that's where the discussion should be, around the thematic focus on the sort of the solution side of things.
Thank you so much, Lars. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Professor Lars Koenen and Dr. Julie Miao. Thank you so much. So we'll be moving straight ahead, thank you very much, to our social innovation panel. So I'd like to ask Rob Hulls, Wade Noonan and Dr. Vishal Kishore, sorry, Professor Vishal Kishore, to please join us up here on the stage. All right, we'll just give our audience a few moments to change over. All right, let's get started. Good morning.
Good morning.
So, our social innovation panel here at Melbourne Knowledge Week for the Melbourne Innovation Districts. My name's Michelle Fitzgerald. I'm from the City of Melbourne. I look after Smart City and I'm the Chief Digital Officer. And thank you for those of us who have just joined us for this part of today's MRD session. I'd like to start by acknowledging the people of the Wairarong and Bunurong language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands we are meeting today. I'd like to respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders past and present. As we get together to talk about social innovation and the future of this part of the city, I'd also like to recognise the wealth of knowledge and expertise that our traditional owners have brought to this work and how we lead it. So we're here today to talk about social innovation. How do we do it? How do we do it well? And importantly, innovating with social structures and outcomes from a mind is about how we make a city that we want to be part of. I've great pleasure in introducing three individuals up here on the stage who probably need very little introduction. So Rob Hulls, Director of the Centre for Innovative Justice at RMIT, the former Attorney General of Victoria. Rob saw the establishment of the state's first Charter of Human Rights and specialist courts in Victoria for our Indigenous community, for people with mental health issues, for people with drug addiction and for victims of family violence. Wade Noonan, the Associate Director of Social Enterprise and Investment at RMIT and Executive Director of the West Melbourne Economic Alliance. Former Ministry of Industry and Employment, Wade led the state government's implementation of a social procurement framework and has championed the social economy for Victoria. And Professor Vishal Kishore, a good friend of mine, Professor of Innovation and Public Policy and Director of the Health Transformation Lab at RMIT. Vishal is also founding architect, Deputy CEO and Chief Strategy Officer of the MedTech Actuator, Australia's national MedTech catalyst. Vishal has been a key collaborator in the development of the MID partnership. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Sianan Kazali. I believe Sianan's here in the front. Sianan was meant to be here today. I am doing my best to represent Sianan, who has lost her voice, unfortunately. Thank you, Sianan, for these wonderful notes. I'll do my best to represent you here today, and we hope you get better soon. Right, so we are going to have a discussion now about social innovation. And I'd like to pass to our panellists to begin with a question. What does social innovation mean to you, practically speaking? And Wade, you're on my left, so I'll start with you.
Thank you, Michelle, for that question. Look, I suppose at its core, social innovation is really about taking an idea or a concept and then converting it into something which creates, in my view, a fairer, more inclusive or sustainable society. And if that's your sort of starting point, there are so many different examples of that happening in a very effective way in the community. In your introduction, you talked about social procurement, and this would be familiar for some in the audience, for others less so. But one of the things that has happened in Victoria in more recent times is we've taken this notion of values-based spending, if you like, to do some good social impact work. In other words, apply social innovation over every part of an area of government administration and spending. So when I was in government, in fact last year the Victorian government was the first jurisdiction to release a social procurement policy. And what that did is it instantly changed, if you like, the frame in which we would define value for money at a government level. So put simply, rather than just looking at cost as being the driver of spending, look at the social impact, I suppose, in relation to what that spending and the power of that spending could in fact achieve. And through that, every time now the government spends more than $20 million, whoever is in fact bidding for a contract now has to set targets around what they intend by way of ensuring that Aboriginal businesses, social enterprises, disadvantaged job seekers are able to engage through the spending and ensure a social dividend for the government spend. That is a contemporary example which puts Victoria as one of the leading jurisdictions, in fact in the world, certainly in Australia, of using social innovation, a concept, an idea, to create something which looks like a fairer, more inclusive and sustainable society.
Yeah, I agree with what Wayne has had to say. I suppose from a definitional point of view, if you're looking at social innovation, you're looking at new and smarter ways of meeting a social need and bringing about social reform. Wade spoke about purchasing power of governments. I remember when I was Attorney General, I realised, for instance, that I was always battling against the big portfolios to get money for legal aid, always competing with education and health and the like. And I took the view that in any democracy, people, to get access to justice, need to get access to legal aid, but there was never going to be enough money out of the budget to meet unmet legal demands. So I decided to look at the purchasing power of government and realise that we're outsourcing about $60 million worth of work to the private profession each year to do work on behalf of the government, legal work. And I thought, well, hang on, why can't we use some of that purchasing power to meet unmet legal demand? So I made it a condition of contracts for any private law firm that wanted to do government work. They had to do a certain amount of pro bono work. They had to embark upon equal opportunity briefing practices to ensure that more women were involved in speaking roles, if you like, in court cases, and they also had to embark upon model litigant principles. Now, to be frank with you, when that came about, and it's easy to talk about, as Wade did, government purchasing power being used to bring about change, I can tell you that the private law firms squealed like stuck pigs overnight when it became a condition of their contracts that they had to embark upon these social justice objectives. But they did it because they wanted the money from government. And in the end, they were actually doing more pro bono work than they had to under the contracts. They were briefing more women than they had to under the contracts. And they realised that by going down this path, it was a win-win. It was a win for the community, meeting unmet legal demand, but it was also a win for those law firms because they found that the best and brightest law students coming out of law school wanted to go and work in those law firms that were doing pro bono work in particular areas. So they got the government money, they were doing really good socially innovative work, and they were getting the best and brightest law students going to join those firms. So you just got to think outside the square and look at new and smarter ways of meeting a social need.
Yes. So I agree with everything that Wade and Rob said. However, I'll answer the question slightly differently and say maybe some thoughts on what social innovation is not. So I think social innovation is not two things that it often is imagined to be. One is that it's new, that it hasn't happened before, that it's some new trend. And the second thing is that it's a posh slogan. So I don't think it's either of those two things. And I think actually, looking at the history of our institution, of RMIT, is a really interesting example. So one way of thinking about RMIT is about 150 years ago, RMIT emerged as a social innovation, a partnership between Trades Hall and a whole bunch of philanthropic and public donations. Out of that came a solution to the question of how do we train, what was then called the working man. And so in a sense, RMIT's always been obsessed about this idea of applied problems that matter to society. And then I would say, additionally, those problems are kind of gritty. They're not shiny. They're not the problems necessarily of incubators and today's incubators and accelerators and shiny tech companies and venture capital. It's a different kind of problem we're solving. And in the latest wave of social innovation, it's nice to be sitting next to him while I say this, so I'm going to blush and he's going to blush. But in a sense, Rob was the godfather of the latest wave of social innovation at our institution. The Centre for Innovative Justice is a really different way of doing social impact and research impact and teaching and learning impact for a university. And in a sense, what's come after that, so the Future Social Services Institute, which is another collaboration with VCOS, or the Health Transformation Lab, which I run, we're all innovating around and building off the model that Rob sort of started about maybe 3 to 5 years ago? Yeah. So not a new thing, social innovation. Not new, not a posh slogan. That's what I'd say.
Thank you. So to build on the theme, Wade, a question for you. What is the state of the social economy in Victoria and what does it need to grow?
Look, how to define a social economy is a challenging question, but I would perhaps point to one of the things I said in my opening remarks in relation to social enterprises. As many of you would know, social enterprise is essentially a commercially viable business that exists for a purpose, for public, for community, rather than for shareholders or owners. And it would come as no surprise here in Victoria, where we view ourselves as a very progressive state, to know that Victoria is the home of social enterprises in Australia. So we have about 5,000 social enterprises in Australia. In Victoria, and about 20,000 overall in Australia. The most mature social enterprises are here in Victoria and are taking the next step forward. So I think probably we're seeing the rise of the social economy and social enterprise as a result of people adopting more of a values-based view of their purchasing habits. So I'm fortunate enough with my wife to have 2 young sons, and my son said the other day, Dad, why did your generation basically stuff the planet and leave it to us to fix? And it's interesting that's an attitude, but I have no doubt now in relation to the way my son sees the world, that in fact everything that he determines from this point forward, including his purchasing, he'll have an overlay around whether or not he believes the organisation exists for a social good and is in fact making the world more sustainable. So the Victorian government, as I indicated last year, saw the opportunity around social enterprises that have largely grown through no intervention or support from the Victorian government or any other government. That usually means that they've done something very, very good in order to get to that point, and I've given you the context as to why I believe there's significant growth. But through a $10 million investment and the creation of a social procurement framework, we now have every major project across Victoria engaging with social enterprises to help lift essentially their capability and give them an opportunity to participate and help grow, because fundamentally social enterprises, when you look at them, are in fact helping young people, they're helping people with disabilities, they're helping disadvantaged women, in fact anyone who essentially faces some complex barriers to gaining and keeping employment. And they're reinvesting in other key issues that are important to those social enterprises, including the environment, of course. So I think what we've got here in Victoria right now is the emergence essentially of a new wave of opportunity for the growth of Victoria's social economy. And people like me, post-public life, want to see that really grow strongly, because in fact we understand that that's a great way for people to engage, but it synchronises very sweetly with the values-based purchasing that is actually going on regardless of where government plays in that space.
Thank you, Wade. Rob, what are the biggest challenges you see for innovative justice in Victoria?
So I had a pretty simple, a bit like me really, I had a pretty simple philosophy when I was Attorney General, and that is people's lives will go along a certain track, and they might have big ups in their lives. They might, get married, have kids, win Tats Lotto, and then they might have big downers in their lives. There could be a death in the family, there could be mental health issues, drug and alcohol addiction issues, homelessness issues, unemployment issues, and at some stage in their life they might come into contact with the justice system. I took the view that at that stage in their life, when they hit the justice system could either push them further into the mire or could act as a bit of a trampoline and bounce their lives back on track. So how do you create a justice system, an innovative justice system that bounces people's lives back on track when they come into contact with it? And that's why I introduced all those specialist courts, drug courts, family violence courts, neighbourhood justice centre, to put wraparound holistic services around people to get their lives back on track when they come into contact with the justice system. Now, it is true there's some bad bastards out there that need to be locked up for a long period of time, but most people who come into contact with the justice system have holistic issues that need to be resolved, otherwise we create this revolving prison door. So I tried to create an innovative justice system that got people's lives back on track. You asked the question, what are the issues associated and the complexities associated with innovative justice? I would have liked to have thought that when I took those proposals to my cabinet colleagues about innovative interventions, they would have said, yes, we agree with that, Halsey, because it's the right thing to do. It's socially appropriate, socially just thing to do. I don't really think that's why they ticked it off. I think because I was able to show that for each dollar you invest in that innovative approach, that holistic approach, putting wraparound services around people who have drug and alcohol issues, you save $4.50 down the track or $5.50 down the track. I think it was that argument, the saving to the public purse of going down this innovative path that got my colleagues over the line. The real issue is selling that to the public. Whenever there's an election on, there is always a law and order debate where politicians stand on the front steps of Parliament House with their law and order baseball bat and say, vote for me, mine's bigger than yours. It's really a matter of, over time, convincing the public that building more and more prison beds doesn't make us safer as a community, actually addressing the underlying causes of why people are coming into contact with the justice system and looking at innovative ways to divert them away from the justice system is not only smarter, not only saves lives, not only makes us safer as a community, but saves us money as well. We still have a long way to go as a community to get that message out there.
Thank you, Rob. Moving on to the topic of partnership and collaboration, and Wade, you mentioned earlier the fact that Victoria is leading in this space of social innovation, and certainly recent research led by the City of Melbourne with our startups indicates that that's actually a draw card for startup talent to Melbourne in particular. Vishal, can you enlighten us in terms of the work of the Health Transformation Lab and the role of partnerships and collaboration and how that's coming to bear?
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Yes, definitely. Yes, I can. Although I do note, Rob, while you were talking about bad bastards who needed to be locked up, Wade Noonan looked right at me. Like, I think that's just... Thanks, Wade. I would say...
Sorry, Vishal, we work very closely with each other, so there was a reason I smiled. Sorry, Vishal.
So the Health Transformation Lab, I want to give you the positive spin on that question, Michelle, and then the slightly less positive spin. So collaboration and health transformation. On one hand, the positive message is that the Health Transformation Lab understands something about the nature of our healthcare system, and that is there are amazing people doing amazing things in pockets. So you've got, great clinicians doing great things, wonderful administrators, wonderful policymakers, technologists, startup players, all doing things to transform our healthcare and our healthcare systems, but they're walled off. They're walled off by their disciplines, they're walled off by their specializations, they're walled off by their institutions, they're walled off by their contexts. So the first thing we say is, well, let's bring them out of the closet and into the light. So let's build communities, coalitions of people who are all kind of moving in a similar direction but are relatively disconnected. Then let's feed them with insight. Let's throw them towards applied problems. So in a sense, the collaboration is the heart of why the model works. The slightly less positive sign is, and I'd be really interested in the views of my colleagues about this as well, for both good and bad reasons, I think the lab is built on the notion that the next set of really big public ideas, the next set of ideas that are going to transform the way that we think about healthcare and the way that the public thinks about healthcare, we're not sure those are going to emerge from the public sector. And some of that's because the public sector, these are complicated problems requiring collaboration at the micro level and all of that sort of stuff. But some of it's also about the fact that our public sectors are moving towards a particular way of thinking about problems and a particular way of engaging with transformative efforts. I'm making no comment about the recent federal election, though one might have a view about it. And so the question for a university and the question for us as players who want to innovate in healthcare is, how do we build platforms for collaboration outside of the mainstream of the health system or outside of the mainstream of the public sector? A place where public sector players can come and engage with us, but that is not completely dependent upon political will or bureaucratic effort. And that's, so in a sense, collaboration is, for both good and bad reasons, at the heart of how we think about health transformation. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thanks, Vishal. And I guess drawing that link back to startups, Wade, how can we better connect social enterprises and support social startups here in Melbourne and Victoria more broadly?
There's a really important role for intermediaries who, as Vishal sort of talked about in a health context, can come together and collaborate, because it's always probably risky to generalise, but I think in Melbourne and Victoria we do collaboration and partnerships pretty well. And I would sort of broadly make the observation, and Rob might have a different view, but I hope he doesn't, that I think government is a player in that, but not necessarily. Shouldn't necessarily be the focus. Government holds a lot of information. As an example, they also have available to them investments. So I think in terms of how we drive a sector like the social economy forward, I think it's really, as Vishal said, on one hand, social innovation is not new. I think what changes is the world, as we all know, constantly changes, and values change. Part of the role, I think, for RMIT in the university sector is to think about how it can apply what it has so that an area such as the Victorian economy, from a social procurement point of view, as an example, can thrive using the expertise such as the university sector has to identify how to fill gaps and craft solutions. So think about this for a moment. If you're building a multi-billion-dollar tunnel in Melbourne, or you're laying, kilometre after kilometre of railway tracks, that's really your focus. How do you actually build in, if you like, a way of engaging disadvantaged job seekers? That is not an easy task for a business, a prime contractor, if you like. That is not going to be their focus. They're going to be reliant on others, essentially, to craft solutions. And I think, again, I'd make the observation that we in Melbourne and Victoria do a pretty good job at actually recognising who the players are and giving them spaces, if you like, to try and craft solutions. And obviously the university sector and RMIT are just one part of that. But we recognise that this is a growth area and there are large gaps to fill going forward, but significant transformational opportunities if we get it right.
Now, I'm just going to make everyone aware we do have a hard stop for 12:30, and I will be passing to the audience shortly for questions, so please get your brains in gear if not already. I know certainly for the last two sessions I've been left with quite a lot of questions. Luckily I'm up here on the stage, so I get to ask a couple more. Rob, sticking with the theme of partnership and collaboration, can you tell us a bit about how your centre is working with community legal centres and with government?
Yeah, so when I came to RMIT, I realised that all universities, RMIT in particular, because of its background, has a corporate social responsibility to not just educate students and give them life-changing experiences, but to the broader public to assist. The view I took was assist disadvantaged members of our community in some way, shape or form. So, to cut to the chase, we have re-established the Mental Health Legal Centre on site at RMIT, co-located also with a law firm called LACW, Law and Advocacy Centre for Women, which is a law firm that assists disadvantaged women who are coming into contact with the justice system. And we're about to co-locate with Youth Law, which is a law firm, community legal centre, that assists disadvantaged youth to try and divert them away from the justice system. So they're three CLCs. I went to the university and said, look, We have law students at RMIT that need clinical placements. We also have social work students. We have a social work course at RMIT. Those students all need clinical placements. We also have a financial counselling course at RMIT, and those students need clinical placements. We have a cohort in our female prison that are mainly victims themselves, victims of family violence, victims of sexual assault. 80% of the women in Dame Phyllis Frost prison have been victims of family violence, for instance. When they come out of prison, they're going to have a whole range of other legal issues that build up while they're in jail. Debts, tenancy issues, family law issues. Unless those legal issues are cleared whilst they're in prison, they'll come out, have the stress of having further contact with the justice system. That will lead to recidivism and them going back into prison. That's the last thing we want as a community. Why don't we get these community legal centres, offer them free rent at RMIT, and the quid pro quo is they have to take our students. Not only law students, but they've got to take our social work students and our financial counselling students, which means they've got to turn themselves as community legal centres into multidisciplinary practices. Not just law community legal centres, but community multidisciplinary practices. University took the punt and said, okay. So we've now co-located with 2 of those 3. We're about to co-locate with youth law as well. And they've been turned into multidisciplinary practices. So we now have lawyers, social workers, financial counsellors working alongside law students, social work students and financial counselling students, going in a multidisciplinary way into Dame Phyllis Frost prison and putting wraparound services around female prisoners to clear them of all those legal issues and follow them out of prison for 6 months to help them with housing, with medical appointments and the like. It is a fantastic program where our students are getting life-changing experiences working in a multidisciplinary environment. The clients, to be frank with you, they don't give a stuff who solves their problems, whether it's a lawyer or a social worker or a financial counsellor. They just want assistance. So we're putting wraparound services around them where our students are opening up real files on real people, working in a multidisciplinary arrangement to assist these people, both while they're in prison and out of prison. And it's a point of differentiation, of course, for the university, because it's pretty expensive to do law courses these days, and you can do it, in a whole range of areas. Students are actually now coming to RMIT because we have this multidisciplinary approach, because we're offering this life-changing clinical education experience. So that's how the partnership works. It's worked so well that, to their credit, RMIT have now decided to find us a new space to operate out of, where we will all be under the one roof, operating in that multidisciplinary environment. It's fantastic, it's working, it's the way of the future. RMIT took a punt and they're making a real difference, I can tell you, to the lives of these disenfranchised, disadvantaged women who are in our prison.
Thank you, Rob. That is so inspiring and such practical solutions. You make it sound really easy, but I'm sure it is not. And congratulations on those outcomes to date. It's just fantastic. Vishal, last but not least, before we pass to our audience, keen to hear your vision for your health transformation lab 5 years from now. What would make you proud to step back, as Rob has today, to say, this, we've done it, we've made it? What would you like to have achieved?
Yeah, lovely. I think there's two things that I would say. The first is, when we think about health transformation, when we think about doing things different in healthcare, we all, you can talk to anybody on the street and say, hey, should we be doing different things in healthcare? Oh, yes, we should definitely be doing great things in healthcare. Okay, wonderful. Should we be involving patients in that? Yes, we should definitely. Does technology have a role? Oh, yes, technology has a role. So in a sense, it's not like we don't know the parameters of the sorts of things that we need to solve, but we often lack the practical, on-the-ground ways of making those changes in ways that matter, as Rob says, to actual people, to the lived experience of people who are suffering, years of sickness, who are not able to engage with their family, engage with society, or flourish. And I would like us to be able to put our hands on our hearts and in 5 years say, we moved the ball forward in respect of practical solutions in healthcare transformation. I mean, if we could do that, it would be amazing, and we're already on the track to do that. I think that's the first thing. The second thing that, for me, and I think this is where you can see the happy coincidence and the happy flow-on effects between the social enterprise work, the justice work, and some of the other social innovation work that we're doing. A big area for me is health equity. So if you spoke to 100 policymakers in healthcare and you asked them to give you their top 5 issues, health equity would always be on there. And if you asked them top 5, top 10, like where does it fall? Oh, definitely top 5, top 3, something like that. Okay, what does it mean? No fucking idea. No one knows what it means. And like for me, this is like the paragon example of a problem that is it's kind of appears theoretical, but it's actually intensely practical. It's multidisciplinary or anti-disciplinary. Like lawyers care about this, economists care about this, social theorists care about this, designers care about this. It's the kind of area that is politically important and practically vital. And I'd like us to pick 3 of those and solve them. So we're on the way with health equity. We'd love to do it together with others. We'd love to do it with all of you. So be in touch and let's solve healthcare. Let's make the world better. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishal. Yeah, I don't think we can take that back.
There's a kind lady out there who started it. I can see her. Thank you. I'll give you $100 later. Yeah.
So over to our audience now. We have an incredible group of individuals here. Your questions, please. We have one here, second from the front. If you'd like to introduce, please, your name, where you're from, before you start with your question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Mike Izella from Shada, and my question is for Rob. And yeah, thanks so much for giving us this insight and this wonderful thing you're doing. My question is around: are there what's the developments around innovative or social justice systems for refugees in Victoria, in particular?
Yeah, I know that, because I've approached some of the leaders at RMIT in relation to assisting members of the refugee community getting scholarships, free education at RMIT in certain areas, and I think that has been progressed fairly well. I mean, education is the key to a whole range of social issues, in my view, and ensuring that people who are coming here as refugees can get access to appropriate educational courses is crucial. When I carry that over to people in prison, for instance, and it could be, immigration refugee detention centres as well, my ultimate dream is for RMIT to so normalise education in those institutions, they actually run classes in the prison where RMIT students sit next to prisoners in prison and normal classes are conducted in that environment. There's no reason why that can't be done in education detention centres as well, in my view, where RMIT students, in particular courses, their classes, yes, some of them are run at buildings at RMIT, others are run online, others are physically run in detention centres, which normalises education, creates mentors between RMIT students and refugees, or in the case of Dame Phyllis Frost, prisoners. To me, that assists people not only in the current environment they're in, a refugee centre or a prison, because they're making contacts with the outside world, but it also is of enormous benefit when they get out of that type of environment.
That's a great question. Thank you. Any other questions from our audience? Yep. A couple more at the back.
You've spoken a lot about the role that educational institutions have, that sort of social startup and innovation in that sector has, and about the role of partnerships between them and the public sector in finding new ways to deliver services. To what extent do you think there is also the degree of change that can be achieved is also dependent on the public's sort of willingness to pay, the public's willingness to pay for those people. I think you said at the beginning that social enterprise isn't shiny, it's not new, it's quite gritty. It deals with lives that may not be attractive to people in a sort of electoral sense. What hope do we have of increasing our willingness as a society to buy more assistance for these people?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and I think Rob's talked a lot about the justice system. One of the things that I'm working on from an RMIT point of view is a pilot to place 50 youth justice clients, as they are at the moment, through a seamless pathway to get the skills that they need to work on large government projects. And in order to do that, RMIT are a partner to that. Rob and his centre have a capacity to potentially have a look at the social impact. I've got others that can look at the economic modelling that Rob talked about when you're trying to form up business cases. I've got every organisation that I've approached, skills-based organisations like Melbourne Polytechnic, everyone wants to play in that space. And I'd make the point that it's a very marginal cost when you consider the social return on investment. And part of the challenge with anything that we try and do by way of shifting views or transforming views or proving up anything is to not forget to do the evaluation piece well. Because I think the evidence, regardless of where you are trying to grow something or you're trying to do something better, the evidence is really key, I think, to shifting attitudes. And, you know, I think as my colleagues sort of talked about, you know, when we come around to elections, we talk about sort of justice and those sorts of issues, you know, there's a lot of scaremongering going on, but I don't think people actually ever lose sight of this notion that, you know, by and large, we all make mistakes. So therefore, we don't lose this view that you ought to get a second chance and perhaps even a third and a fourth sometimes. The bit I think that we, as a community and society, grapple with is how best to do that. And that's where social innovation in its purest form can actually generate solutions which can be extremely powerful, both at the social impact level and also the economic level. And again, anecdotally, I think there is vast support across the community to use social enterprise and the social economy generally to drive better outcomes across the environment, socially, economically, whichever way you want to look at it. There is great opportunity.
I loved your question, and I think it's in fact the great challenge for all of us who care about social innovation and public purposive innovation. How do you convince people to pay? And in a sense, it's perhaps the argument varies differently depending on different areas. So in justice, it has a particular rendition. In health, it has another rendition. And one of the things that I think we don't do a great job of is that we don't bring the human perspective to the problem as quickly and as smoothly as we may. So let me give you just a little example. When I was in the Department of Health, we would prepare these budget bids to go to the BERC committee, the Budget Estimates and Review Committee, Expenditure and Review Committee. And we would articulate these budget proposals in the most ridiculous bloody form, where we would talk about, cost effectiveness, and so, things that were about saving the lives of children or people who had been hit by a car or delay rates in ambulance. We'd articulate these things in really bland, cold ways. We would use, cost effectiveness measures and efficiency measures. And in a sense, we never told the human story, or we often didn't tell as clearly as we might the human story. And it turns out that all of those members sitting around the BERC table are people with mothers and children and families. And if we told them the story of, when your kid can't breathe, what is the acceptable delay on an ambulance arriving at your house? It turns out that they answer that really, really, really differently than if you say, the cost effectiveness of this kind of intervention is a 4.3%. Like, what the fuck does that even mean? So, in a sense, we've got to get better And when we took the strategy, I swore again for you, Wade, when we took the strategy of trying to speak to ministers as human beings, we got really different kinds of outcomes. And if you speak to populaces and the public as human beings about the human problems that we're solving in human ways, it turns out you get different kinds of outcomes and different sorts of momentum generated. So that would be my humble suggestion in that regard.
And just on that, and I know it is difficult to speak to ministers as human beings, I get that, but the cost of not going down this path also has to be enunciated pretty clearly. The cost of not going down the path we've spoken about means as a community we'll spend more money in the justice space on prison beds than hospital beds or school classrooms. Like it's that simple, and it's not just me saying that. The Ombudsman has produced a report that says exactly the same thing. Unless you go down this innovative path, you will end up as a community spending more money on prison beds than hospital beds and school classrooms. And I think the penny will drop with governments when they go to the polls and they make a whole range of commitments in relation to rail crossing removals and whatever it is federally. And they realise, well, we've made all these commitments. My God, we can't fulfil these commitments because of the rejections for new prison beds and having to build very expensive new prisons. We have to think of innovative ways to reduce the number of people going into our prisons.
And I think due to time, we've just reached the end of our questions, so apologies to our audience, but if you're lucky, you might catch these three out at the festival shortly after this. You spoke of pennies dropping. I've noted next time I'm on a panel with Vishal, there will be a swear jar on the stage just for you. But all jokes aside, this is a really, really important topic for Melbourne. Personally, I feel we're really fortunate to have individuals such as Wade, Rob and Vishal leading the charge with others at RMIT and with other organisations across our state. So please join me in thanking Wade, Rob and Vishal for being with us this morning. We have a wonderful group here. Please stick around. We have a lot more in store for you for MID Day today. Hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at Prototype Street and the Melbourne City DNA exhibit. If not, go out and have a look. There's team members from City of Melbourne and from our partners who will happily host you. We have the Utopian Foods Cafe at the back. You can stick around for some lunch. We look forward to seeing you out there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.